What I like about it is that I know for sure that if you get married, you will stick to it. Cliff Richard was married to the same woman for 50 years. She married his best friend instead, then someone else, and finally she died in his arms. He never got married or had kids, he just kept singing while hiding the biggest breakup in the history of British music. When the cops broke into his house in 2014, they weren't the first ones to hurt him. The BBC had already agreed to something in secret. The claims were not true. But there was real damage. He got thinner. He got chickenpox. He was unable to rest. He said that his own home felt dirty. The man who used to pack Wembley Stadium was now too scared to leave his house. In 1940, Harry Roger Webb was born in King George's Hospital in Lucknow, British India. At the time, the world was already in the midst of war and change. Protests for Indian freedom were getting worse. During Direct Action Day in 1946, there were riots, and British people started leaving the colony. The Webbs were among them. In the colonies, Harry's dad worked, but by 1948 it was clear that the empire was falling apart. They didn't take a car or an airplane, though. Instead, they took a slow, crowded ship across the Indian Ocean. The SS Ranchi was their escape. It carried a lot of British families for 3 long weeks, leaving them with no home to return to. After being servants in the sun, they had to deal with rations and grey skies. England was cold and still getting back on its feet after the war. It turned out that the Webbs were in a small house in Cashleton, Surrey. The big rooms and warm nights were over. That rough start made him stronger, even though he had lived in comfort before. He feels like he needs to prove himself and make this strange new life into something bigger after that trip. Harry Webb soon stopped being there. Someone named Harry Grader X was paying close attention. He knew how to handle ability and spot trends. "You need a name that sounds like rock," he told Harry. Cliff was an idea. In honor of the crazy American rock star Little Richard, Richard came along. Harry Webb was gone, and Cliff Richard was born. He didn't just change his name, he changed British music as well. On August 29, 1958, a song called Move It came out. It was rough, loud, and defiant. Cliff was only 18 years old when his song went to number 2 on the UK charts. It was a big deal because it meant that British teens finally had their own rock star. He wasn't copying American stars, he was making something new. That song made it possible for others to follow. It wasn't just the music, it was the craze. That same year, Cliff went on tour and Britain went crazy. Girls screamed, cried, and passed out, and boys hated him for taking the limelight away from them. Security guards couldn't keep the crowds from getting out of hand. It was Elvis-level chaos. But this was in London, Manchester, and Leeds. The newspapers and record companies loved it. In 1959, the crazy levels doubled when Cliff released Living Doll. He didn't want to because he thought the song was too soft and fake. "I hated it," he told his producer, but the band changed it to a slow country ballad. It was number 1 for 6 weeks and sold 770,000 copies. In November, he got a silver disc, and by January, he had a gold disc. Then came Travel in Light, which was also number 1 for 5 weeks. Between the two, Cliff sold over 1 million records, which was something no one else in Britain had ever done. Hollywood called. Cliff was only 19 years old when he agreed to be in Serious Charge, a dark and serious movie about homosexuality, false accusations, and serious moral questions. It shocked everyone that he did it. The next year, he was in Espresso Bongo, a movie that made fun of the music business. With these parts, Cliff proved he wasn't just a teen idol. He wanted to act, grow, and be more than a singer. This was something British pop stars had never done before. Then came Summer Holiday. The movie's premiere in London on January 10, 1963, drew 3,000 fans so thick that Cliff couldn't even get out of his car. Even though he missed his own premiere that night, it didn't matter because the soundtrack went straight to number 1 on the UK albums chart before the movie even came out in theaters across the country and stayed there for 14 weeks. Several songs from the movie, including The Next Time, Bachelor Boy, Summer Vacation, and even Foot Tapper, an instrumental by The Shadows, also made it to number 1. The movie was the second biggest hit in Britain in 1963, after From Russia with Love. That same year, Cliff was voted the most popular movie star in the UK. But then the Beatles came along, and most people thought Cliff would lose sight of his fame. But in 1964, during the height of Beatlemania, Cliff had 6 top 10 hits. The Beatles only got 5. His hits like Constantly on the Beach and I Could Easily Fall in Love with You kept him in the public eye. Even when the Beatles were changing music and taking over America, Cliff was still doing well at home. The battle was real. His movie Summer Holiday and The Beatles' A Hard Day's Night were shown at the same time in theaters across the country. Both broke records, but people in Britain remembered who came first. Even Paul McCartney said it. The Beatles left for Hamburg because Cliff had everything sewn up in Britain. And John Lennon said it straight out before Cliff Richard and Move It, there was nothing worth listening to in England. Then in 1965, something really unexpected happened. They asked readers all over the world to choose the best male singer in the world, and Cliff won. He beat Elvis, Lennon, and McCartney. That year the Beatles released Help and Rubber Soul, and Elvis was still selling out everywhere, but Cliff won because he kept growing, even as the world changed around him. He didn't try to be the Beatles or follow the latest trends. Instead, he found a balance between pop ballads, faith-friendly movies, and real charm. He was consistent, which was important to his fans all over the world. He was their rock before and after the British invasion. In June 1966, something happened in the music world that no one saw coming. Cliff Richard didn't walk out on stage at Earl's Court to sing. Instead, he stood next to American evangelist Billy Graham and told thousands of people that he had become a Christian. This wasn't just a quiet personal decision, it was a bold public testimony that was seen all over the country. Fans who thought of him as a British Elvis or Little Richard were shocked. Some people cried, while others just stood there in shock. The man they loved for his rebellious spirit had gone in a direction they hadn't seen coming. But this wasn't a random event, it was the end of a spiritual journey that had begun 2 years before. Doing it in front of Billy Graham's huge crowd in the middle of the swinging 1960s added a level of seriousness that no one could ignore. People thought that rock stars should be rebellious, push the limits, and break rules. Cliff's announcement went against everything that people thought a pop icon should be. Almost right away, people panicked. Some fans thought it was the end of his music career, and people in the business said he might quit and become a teacher. That thought wasn't too far off. Cliff himself thought about quitting the stage for good. He thought that maybe he couldn't be a good Christian and stay in the spotlight at the same time. Music magazines started to talk about who would replace him, and booking agents stopped calling him. The business thought that you couldn't be religious and famous at the same time. Cliff wasn't sure either for a while, but then something changed. Cliff didn't go away, he stayed, and by staying he made something new. He didn't give up his faith or music, he found a way to combine the two. He was the first big UK pop star to live out his faith in public while staying in the charts. He showed that you didn't have to choose between two lives. You could be true to yourself and still sell out concerts. This choice wasn't just about keeping his job, it changed who he was. Cliff later admitted that his rock and roll image had been fake. He wasn't really sure of himself, he was just acting that way. But when he became a Christian, things changed. He said, "My confidence grew. My thoughts changed. Being right all the time wasn't important. There was no longer any pressure to play a part. Because he felt free to be himself, he did better on stage, even though the Beatles and other psychedelic acts were at the top of the charts at the time. While everyone else tried to keep up, Cliff got stronger because he finally felt like himself. But by the mid-1970s, Cliff's career had hit a low point. In 1975, he didn't have a single song in the charts, and people began to think his time was up. But then Devil Woman came out in April 1976. The song was louder, edgier, and darker than anything he'd done before. It told a strange story about a psychic, a curse, and a stray cat. But most importantly, it rocked. It went to number 9 in the UK and number 6 in the US, which was his first top 10 in the US. It sold over 2 million copies. Cliff was back. And even more shocking, the hard rock crowd loved him. Jimmy Page, Eric Clapton, and Elton John were seen supporting Cliff's comeback album by wearing I'm Almost Famous patches. These guitar legends showed respect for a man who was once thought to be clean-cut and out of date. One music critic even said Cliff's new album was as good as Marvin Gaye's best work, so it wasn't just a comeback. That was a huge change. The kid from the 1950s was now praised as a serious rock star. But he didn't stop there. In 1987, after more than 25 years in the business, Cliff released Always Guaranteed, a modern pop album that skipped the cheesy synths of the time and sounded classic. He worked with Alan Tarney again, this time because of Thriller. The result was a platinum record that went to number 5 in the UK, stayed there for 24 weeks, and sold over 1.3 million copies. 4 singles from the album made it into the UK Top 40, and some even went silver, selling 250,000 copies. Cliff showed that he could compete with the best artists, even in the late 1980s. Then came Christmas 1988, when he released Mistletoe and Wine, a soft religious holiday song. In the middle of summer, he recorded it with tinsel hanging over the mic. The single started at number 7, went straight to number 1 the next week, and stayed there for 4 weeks. It sold 750,000 copies in 6 weeks, and was the biggest UK single of the year, beating out U2, Kylie Minogue, and Phil Collins. In 2024, it had gone platinum, and was still making $100,000 a year in royalties. Fans still couldn't get enough of it. But Cliff's release of his 100th single in May 1989 was one of the most impressive events. At the time, no other British artist had ever done that, and to celebrate, he invited 2,000 fans to the London Palladium. They heard 6 unreleased songs and were asked to vote. The Best of Me, the song that came in second, was the one he chose. It went to number 2 in the UK and earned a silver certification.
It also went to number 2 in Ireland, 25 in New Zealand, and 59 in Australia. It wasn't just about hitting 100. As the music business changed over and over, Cliff Richard's concert at Wembley Stadium in June 1989 wasn't just another show, it was a full-on spectacle. They called it an event, and it lived up to its name. Wembley was packed with thousands of people who came to see more than just music. In the first half of the concert, Cliff paid tribute to the TV show Oh Boy, which started his career in 1958. It was like going back in time. Cliff didn't perform alone. He brought on the Vernon's Girls, the Dallas Boys, and the Kalin Twins, 3 bands that used to rule British rock and roll. The first half was like walking into a living jukebox for the fans. The second half was when Cliff showed that he wasn't just a nostalgia act. He sang his newer hits with the confidence of someone who had been on top of the charts for decades. Cameras were rolling. The show was professionally filmed, and later came out as a live album and TV special. It wasn't just a gig, it was a carefully planned historical moment. In the same year, 1989, Cliff got the Bright Award for Outstanding Contribution to Music, which was the highest honor the awards could bestow. But the trophy wasn't the only important thing. He had become the only singer in history to have #1 hits in 5 straight decades, the 1950s, 1960s, 1980s, and now the 19... He had already released 100 singles by that point. The Best of Me was the 100th, and it shot to the top of the charts. Cliff had 65 top 10 hits and 14 #1s at that point. No one else came close. Another big event happened a year later, on June 30th.
It was Knebworth Park, a huge charity concert to support the Nordhoff Robbins Music Therapy charity. Cliff played with the Shadows, but they were just one part of a legendary lineup that included Paul McCartney, Elton John, Pink Floyd, Eric Clapton, Genesis, and Phil Collins. When Tears for Fears started, it rained, but the crowd stayed and sang. Cliff stood with rock's biggest names and proved once again that he belonged. Then in December 1990, a new song called Savior's Day came out. It was written by Chris Eaton in October 1989, and he pitched it to Cliff at a Christmas party in a Rolls-Royce. The demo was played in the car, and Cliff said, "This is a #1. He was right. It started at number 6 on December 8th, moved up to number 3, and then to number 2. On December 23, it beat Ice Ice Baby to the top of the charts. People dressed for winter sweating while pretending it was Christmas in the video shot at DL Dundor and Swanage in sunny September, but the effect was magical, and the momentum didn't stop. Around that time, Cliff released Private Collection 1979 won platinum and sold over 1.2 million copies, making it his biggest album to date. His name was played on every radio station in Britain with hits like We Don't Talk Anymore, which sold almost 5 million copies around the world. This wasn't just nostalgia, he was also selling new pop stars and leading the way in an industry that was changing quickly. But then things took a strange turn when Cliff released The Millennium Prayer in 1999. Mainstream radio didn't like it. BBC Radio 2 wouldn't play it because they said it wasn't popular with a wide audience, but they did play Tina Turner and Cher, who are both about Cliff's age. Radio 1 had already dropped older acts like the Beatles, and Chris Evans of Virgin Radio once said Cliff was too old. DJs had to pay extra to play the song. Cliff's fan club even held a protest outside of the BBC because they felt like the music business had turned its back on him. But then the miracle happened. The Millennium Prayer went to #1 for 3 weeks, from November 28, 1999, without a major label, without airplay, and without the machine behind him. Fans bought a lot of copies, and churches played it. It wasn't just a hit, it was a protest. Cliff had beaten the system, and it didn't just work in the UK. The song also made it to #2 in Australia and New Zealand, and to the top 20 in several European countries. There was no heavy radio play or promotion, just people who believed in the song. It raised a lot of money for the children's charity. Cliff had shown that you could have faith, raise money, and still be at the top of the charts. Aside from music, Cliff's personal life had its own stories, some of which were heartbreaking. Olivia Newton-John, a 22-year-old Australian singer, performed on Cliff Richard's TV show It's Cliff Richard in 1971. They hit it off right away, and Cliff later said, "I knew right away she was a friend for life." He wasn't wrong, they stayed friends for more than 50 years. But until Cliff's book came out in 2020, no one knew that he had fallen in love with her. He wrote, "When many of us were in love with Olivia, she was engaged to someone else. I missed my chance." Cliff never got married. Olivia seemed to have left a mark that would never go away. He also said that everyone who knew her eventually fell in love with her. To make things even more complicated, she was engaged to Bruce Welch, who was in Cliff's band The Shadows. Olivia met Bruce when she was the opening act in 1968, and their relationship was explosive from the start. Bruce was still married, and their affair made the news. They were engaged for 5 years but never got married. During that time, Olivia worked closely with Cliff, touring with him and singing with him. When she finally broke up with Bruce in 1973, he became depressed and even hurt himself. There were rumors that she had broken up with Cliff instead. No one said it out loud, but the silence was deafening. Even though things were rough between them, Cliff and Olivia kept performing together. For more than 40 years they sang duets that fans still remember. Suddenly from Xanadu, their 1980 hit, was just one of many. They also sang When I'm 64 and other classics live. Cliff often said Olivia had a kind of grace no one else could match. There was one last duet between them in October 2015 at Royal Albert Hall for Cliff's 75th birthday. They sang Suddenly One Last Time. Cliff used that live recording as a tribute to Olivia on his 2023 album, Cliff with Strings, My Kind of Life. The hardest part was when he called Olivia 3 weeks before she died. She was as happy, warm, and positive as ever. "Good morning, Cliff. How are you, sweetheart?" She didn't sound like she was about to die. Cliff later wrote, "I never thought for a moment of that call that I'd be writing this." Olivia had been fighting breast cancer for 30 years. She was strong, but she never let her pain show. Cliff was devastated when she died on August 8, 2022. "I hate that word," he said about death. Instead, he said she had just stopped living. It was his way of dealing with the silence she left behind. On August 14, 2014, Cliff Richard was relaxing at home in Portugal when he turned on the TV. As he watched live on TV, his heart stopped. Helicopters were flying over his home in Berkshire, and police officers were going through his things. His first thought was simple but scary. They looked like thieves, but it wasn't a robbery. It was a full-on police raid that was shown all over the world thanks to a secret deal between the BBC and South Yorkshire Police. The BBC knew about it ahead of time. They even called it the money shot within the company. They wanted drama, and they got it. Cliff Richard was ruined. He was 77 years old at the time, a national icon with a perfect record, and had worked in the music business for decades. Now he was crying in the kitchen. The pictures were shown all over the world, from the UK to Australia. Cliff cried in court as he read the list of countries that showed his private life falling apart. He later said that the stress made him feel like he was going to have a heart attack or stroke. It all started with one accusation. A man in his 40s said that Cliff had beaten him up at a Billy Graham rally at Bramall Lane Stadium in 1985. That rally was big. 200,000 people came over 5 nights, and Cliff had been on stage with Graham, supporting the Christian cause he had been fighting for since 1966. But the claim quickly fell apart. The man said the alleged assault happened in a room with sports equipment. The problem was that room didn't exist in 1985, and the sports equipment was stored somewhere else. The police spent 22 months looking into this, ignoring what their own officers who were guarding Cliff that night said. There were officers with him the whole time, but they weren't even questioned. The investigation took almost 2 years, cost $800,000, and found no charges, not a single one. But the damage was already done. As if the live raid and endless headlines weren't enough, the BBC then put in for Scoop of the Year. Yes, the BBC entered the raid footage into an award competition while Cliff was still being investigated. That move alone earned the BBC an extra $20,000 in aggravated damages later on. The court called it haughty and cocky, but the number of people killed kept going up behind the scenes. It turned out that Cliff had become depressed. Some days he couldn't sleep, and other days he couldn't even lift his arms. He got shingles, lost weight, and passed out from exhaustion. He said he felt like his house had been hacked, and he stopped feeling safe in his own home. He couldn't do simple things like promoting his book or putting out an album. Everything stopped because everyone saw him as a story. Then the strangest thing happened. Right after the raid aired, a man tried to blackmail Cliff. He wanted money and said he would spread lies if he wasn't paid. The man was arrested, but strangely, his original claim of sex abuse was still taken seriously in the investigation. As a result, even though someone tried to blackmail Cliff with the raid, he was still seen as a real victim. In the end, South Yorkshire Police paid Cliff $400,000 in damages, even though they admitted that telling the BBC about what happened was illegal. They said sorry in public, but even millions of pounds in payouts don't erase trauma. The BBC had to pay Cliff nearly $2 million in legal fees on top of the money they had already given him in damages. But Cliff wasn't happy with how prosecutors explained their decision. The CPS said there wasn't enough evidence to bring charges, but Cliff wanted it to be written down that there was no evidence at all. What scared him the most was the cloud of suspicion that something might still be there. He said, "I feel I've been smeared, not by the police but by the BBC." In court he broke down again as he talked about his fear of being forever tainted, even though he was cleared and had done nothing wrong. He told MPs that being named in public had made it impossible for him to look people in the eye, and that no matter what, people would always be curious. He had every right to think that. His name was all over the news, and his face was shown while police took stuff away that didn't mean anything. His whole life had been boiled down to one raid, one rumor, and a media circus. In July 2018 he won his case against the BBC. The judge said that Cliff had a reasonable expectation of privacy and that the BBC had breached it in a very exploitative way. This changed the way that British media could report on police investigations going forward.
But for Cliff, it was never just about winning. It was about staying alive and telling everyone that what happened to him wasn't just unfair, it was cruel. He never got those 2 years back. He never got rid of the news stories, the stares, or the feeling that his name would always have a shadow over it no matter how clean it was.